Evening and welcome everybody to tonight's MDU webinar. I'm really pleased to say that tonight we're doing it jointly with Ibreez from Road to the UK. We've got Ibreez here who is now, I understand, a doctor in pharmaceutical medicine, but has worked in hospital practice in the UK as well. And the inspiration for inviting her to speak was our conference aimed at international medical graduates last year, where I think we're sort of mindful of the detailed medico-legal content we've got on our website, but Ibreez did a brilliant job of bringing to life some sorts of concepts that are useful in day-to-day practice, and we thought it'd be really good to ask her to share her experience with those. And we've also got Dr. Sarah Jarvis, one of the senior medico-legal advisors at the MDU, who will be talking to us with Ibreez about the range of medico-legal concepts they've got. I will be keeping an eye on the Q&As in the background. My name's Ed Nandasoma. I'm the head of advisory services at the MDU. I'll be keeping an eye on the questions, so keep them coming. Please put them in as early as possible, because I also want to pick out the things that are of most concern or interest to the audience as well. So we'll deal with the questions at the end, but please do keep them coming through. Your engagement, as I say, is really valued. So without further ado, let me hand over to Ibreez, who will start the presentation.
Thank you so much. I just want to see, is everyone able to see the presentation? Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to try and keep this as light and as exciting as possible, because I do understand with topics that we're going to be covering today may seem kind of dry, and I've got Sarah there in the background as well to help me out and try and bring it more of an aspect of the medical legal bits to it. All right, so let's get into the first part: surprises in UK medical practice. So these are the things I think really, when I started working in the NHS, everyone kind of talked about, everyone generally knew, but it was just kind of one of those things that you read and you didn't think practically you would have to worry about it too much. So the topics are going to be over capacity, confidentiality, and consent, documentation, duty of candor, knowing your limitations, prescribing safely, and then raising concerns, and we'll summarize at the end. So as you can appreciate, these are kind of the boring things that you feel like, yeah, somebody's mentioned this at some point, but we're going to try and make it very exciting and informative today. Okay, so within the first aspects of capacity, confidentiality, and consent, these three C's, I think everyone hears, everyone says it, it's thrown around a lot. The general understanding is, you'll say, is that you always assume capacity unless there's anything else to make you think otherwise. And on top of that, it's really important for you in different clinical settings to know how to assess capacity. So what I mean by that is sometimes people feel with capacity and consent, it could just come down to being something in a surgical specialty if you're about to do a procedure. But to be honest with you, in everything we do, whenever we see a patient, whenever we have any aspect of care, this should be paramount. The same thing goes for confidentiality. We don't sometimes think, when we pick up a phone and we have to call someone, are we actually ensuring it is the right person that we're calling? Is it the next of kin? Has that all been outlined? The other thing is with the consent process, we may feel like, okay, what if they aren't saying it to us, but we understand it's implied consent? You need to be very careful with implied consent and document as much as possible. If there's a situation, for instance, that you go up to a patient and you tell them, hello, my name is Ibreez, I just need to take some blood from your arm, is that okay? And they just stick out an arm and they don't say anything. As much as possible, though, you need to know the situation surrounding beforehand. It shouldn't be that you just assumed through this implied consent that you're fine to proceed. In the bigger sense about capacity, there's a lot to go into, especially when you think of fluctuating capacity, capacity that may change dependent on the situation. So I will give you a really quick example that actually Ibrahim faced his first night shift in the NHS, where he unfortunately had an individual who had come in with a pretty serious head injury. They were in their early 30s, and they didn't have the best grasp of English, and they wanted to self-discharge. As much as could be understood from what was happening, they felt they didn't need to stay in any longer. They wanted to go home. And he, in an SHO capacity in this night shift, needed to determine if this patient had the capacity to make this huge clinical decision. Because his understanding from what he had spoken from, speaking to the radiologist, registrar overnight. This patient needed to stay for observation. So I'll tie into this with the next part as well, but here is where it's very important for you to have a very good conversation. In his situation, he also ensured he had a chaperone and somebody, even though they couldn't unfortunately get an interpreter overnight, they spoke with the consultant on what would be an appropriate way to at least find a middle ground. So they called in the patient's mother, and they tried as best as possible to ascertain if this individual did have capacity. And after this discussion with the patient, with their family, and with the consultant, it was determined the patient did have capacity to leave the hospital. So you might think on the outset, well, it doesn't sound like they should have, but the important thing is you have to make sure you're following due process of what has to be asked and what has to be understood. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah if there's anything else you want to put in from the medical legal aspect that I might have missed out.
Great, thank you. Sorry about that, everybody. I don't know, we had perfect sound at the start, so I'm not sure what the issue is there, but thank you, Ibreez. I think this is a really interesting scenario, and I think that one of the questions that often comes to us is kind of, is there a list of questions we can use to ask capacity? And I think there's a lot of confusion between, say, capacity and assessing things like orientation and mental state, etc. And I think the scenario that you explained had a lot of those elements. You know, you identified the issues there in terms of whether, you know, we know that the statutory test for capacity is things like, you know, can they understand the information? You talked about the language needs of the patient there. Can they use and weigh the information in the balance? And can they communicate a decision? So the other point about capacity is that obviously you can't conclude that a patient lacks capacity unless they've had all sort of practical support to get there. And clearly there were all sorts of elements in the scenario where all those things will get in. The other thing I think is that, and this is a really important point you drew out, is that sometimes we look at that capacity decision in that scenario as an all or nothing thing. Do they want to leave hospital or not? The other really important part you got in there is that actually, what are the options? What decision are we actually asking them to make? Because is there a middle ground that might be acceptable, might solve this problem another way? So have we presented, as well as understanding their capacity to refuse treatment, have we actually presented what the reasonable options for treatment are? So I thought that was a really interesting scenario from that perspective. And before I forget, at the very beginning, you referred to the presumption or the assumption of capacity. The really important thing about that is that clearly that's the law essentially saying that as human beings, as adults, we'll all start from that point where we can make our decisions. As doctors, if you're faced with a situation where somebody is doing something unwise, it doesn't mean they can't do that. It's very explicit saying they can, but it does say that should really put us on notice that we maybe need to explore the situation further and do exactly as was described. So no, I thought that was a really interesting scenario.
Exactly. Sometimes what we feel is the very best for the patient, they may not feel that's the case, but if they have the capacity to make that decision at the end of the day, we have to respect them and their decision. So on to the next one that'll kind of tie in. So documentation, you know, it's fine that I've said, you know, this is the conversation they had, this is what's happened, but ensuring that the documentation is tip top is really what made the situation so complex later on, because Ibrahim eventually was called in for a court inquiry for this case, because unfortunately the patient was found dead later that morning. So everything that he had documented with regards to the conversation had with the patient, the conversation surrounding their care, getting somebody to interpret the language, conversation with the team and the consultant, had to be documented in the way that it was very clear what time the conversation was had, who was part of the conversation, as well as the roles, and what was laid out to the patient and the patient's responses, as well as the complete physical examination and how they assess the capacity. So with all of this, you might think to yourself, especially when we're talking about legibility, you're in a high pressure situation. You want to write everything, but you feel that because you need to get all of those words from your brain onto the paper, it may look very messy, but as best as possible, try and keep everything in your notes nice and neat. If it's typing up your notes, that's the same thing. Try not to use too much of acronyms or jargon that somebody else outside of the clinical setting would not easily be able to understand, because you're just making it very clear for them from the outset that they can read it and say, fine, this is what's happened. If, for instance, now there's something that you realize after the fact you hadn't documented, this is where retrospective documentation comes into place. You need to clearly mention that it is retrospective, putting the time and date of when you did this update. You should not be going back into the notes and then writing it, if it was from yesterday, writing it today in yesterday's notes as if you had done it yesterday. It should be as current and up to date as possible. I'm not going to try and scare you and make you think, oh, well, if I don't document it this way, it'll come up in court and they'll say, oh, look at this doctor's handwriting or what they've written here. But as much as possible, if you try and keep it in the back of your mind, that maybe not in a legal setting, but tomorrow on the ward round, somebody will be reading this. It should be nice and apparent to them what exactly has happened during your time reviewing the patient or updating their care. And of course, making it very clear what your next steps are for their care. And
thank you for that, Ibreez. I'm going to depart from the plan and go to a couple of the questions because I think they're really, really helpful in this setting. We've got one here where the question here is, how did that patient have capacity if we didn't prove there is no intracranial bleed? And I think that is a really important sort of distinction in capacity. To answer that question, capacity is not pathology related. It's a functional test. And that test is whether they can understand the information related to the test, retain it for long enough to weigh the pros and cons of the decision they make, use that to make their decision, and then to communicate it to you. So that's really important. So, of course, with a patient who has a head injury there, and that's the alarm that says, look, I need to assess this person's capacity, in the same way that a diagnosis of dementia would say to you, oh gosh, we need to assess this person's capacity on this point. But those conditions don't mean that a person, by definition, doesn't have capacity. Exactly. So that's the point. Now, clearly, there are lots of clinical things here. If they have an intracranial bleed, they may deteriorate, etc. These things rarely move that quickly, do they? In that the assessment that you went through, it strikes me that would have taken quite a period of time with that person waiting. So you've got some insurance there. But I thought that was a really important question because it's that really separate thing. Capacity isn't a pathology-related thing. It's a functional thing. We've also got a question here saying, and this moves on to this side, saying, look, can you tell us what it means we're here to properly document everything so we can be safe. How can documentation save us? Well, I mean, looking at the really good points on this slide here, we say here, look, if it's not been documented, it hasn't been done. Now, I would say to you, that's not absolutely true. We say it a lot. We can rely on recollection, etc. It's just really difficult, unless it's been recorded somewhere or it can be pieced together, to evidence it if there is some dispute. When we talk about documenting properly, there are basic things that Ibreez has been through here in terms of if it's a handwritten note, writing legibly, and even if it's a type note, making sure that's clear. It's timed occasionally, it's timed and dated appropriately. It's a contemporaneous note, and it has got those elements to it. Date, time, location, nature of the entry, etc. There are other things about the quality of a note. So say in the scenario that we had, something that documents a meaningful discussion. So if, say, for example, you're doing a consent discussion and put risks and benefits explained, that will carry much less weight than something that says, patient has come to me with this problem. Say my background is in gastroenterology. If you have a patient with, say, gallbladder symptoms, something that says gallbladder symptoms, tick, pros and cons explained for cholecystectomy, that will carry much less weight than someone came to me with these symptoms. They have been intrusive, have time on work, 3 hospital admissions. They've explained to me they really want a surgical solution to this because it's really disruptive. And then to go on to explain what you've spoken to about the procedure. Similarly, for capacity assessments, I'd really say actually quoting what the person has said to you can be really good. at showing that you have been through this. You've explored their process of logic, which will either make sense or lead you to a point where you think they don't have capacity to make that decision. So I think all those elements are important. The retrospective documentation point, I will say, because we do see a lot of avoidable problems that comes through the issue of retrospective documentation, I think it's really important, as you've said here, to mark them as being retrospective with the current date and time. I'd also explain why you're adding a retrospective entry. So, for example, if you're writing up a cardiac arrest, everyone understands that, you know, you're not making a note whilst you're doing the resuscitation, etc. So do that. Also, don't just rely on the audit trail, because that isn't always obvious unless somebody looks for it. So it can sometimes lead to concerns that somebody has tried to make the note look contemporaneous when it isn't. So I think those are the points I'd raise from there.
Thank you.
And sorry, I'm being distracted by the questions, but as somebody said here, capacity remains situation and time specific. You know, and the comment here, patients with learning difficulties are extremely difficult in the heat of a busy ward round. How can we minimize medical legal liability in those situations? I think the one thing I would say there is, what decision do you have to make there and then? You know, it's capacity, time, and decision specific. You know, you've got to, you've got to think what decision needs to be made there and then. If it really doesn't, if it's an emergency, there are some protections in the Mental Capacity Act for taking action to preserve life. If a decision isn't immediately necessary, it gives you the opportunity to put proper support in place to assess things over a period of time, really understand what information is key to the decision that you need to get across.
So, duty of candor. I personally feel this is probably the scariest thing when people read about it, because sometimes what can happen here, or more often than not, you're in a situation where you're apologizing for something that you were not necessarily involved in. And sometimes I feel that as an international doctor, when I talk to other IMGs about this, they're concerned about, will this now fall back on me? That I didn't make this mistake, and now something's happened and I've got to talk to someone about it, but what if they blame me? So I'll give you a quick example when I had to deal with a duty of candor situation. So it was a really busy Saturday. I was the medical registrar, and I get called for a medical emergency for a medical outlier patient on a surgical ward, which is, of course, how every horror movie starts. A patient who's already, unfortunately, not in the best situation in terms of where they are in the hospital. And of course, when I get there, it's very difficult for me to assess who's actually responsible for the patient and what's happened. All I can understand when I see them is that they are unconscious. So once I did my A to E and figured out what had happened, what I found out from going through everything was that the patient had been admitted late on Friday evening, and unfortunately, through some sort of course of information and I guess misunderstanding, they had been incorrectly prescribed their insulin, and unfortunately had been given double the dose of what they should have been having, and suffered hypoglycemic episode as a result. And because it was also the weekend, there was unfortunately no reconciliation that was done. The patient had been changed to so many places, nobody was actually following through. So my situation was now one where I had to first explain to the patient and their family, who was present when this had all gone down, what exactly had happened. And of course, yes, I apologized, because even though you might say, well, Ibreez, but this wasn't your fault. Of course not. But as a result of what had happened, the individuals involved deserve an apology. They had to see their loved one go through something very unfortunate. This person had to go through something that could have been very easily avoided. I went through exactly, as I said to you all, what had happened with them. I had one of the F1s with me at the time so that they could understand the process of duty of candor. And of course, it's always good to have an extra person there with you in these types of conversations that may be a little bit more difficult, so that you have another person's viewpoint that you can reflect from. And of course, again, the very important documentation: who was present, what conversation was had, what questions were raised, how did I answer those questions, and if there was anything further they felt could have been done, or they felt needed to have been done ahead of time, I made sure to document that as well. And as part of all of this, I sent out an email to the individuals I felt were people who needed to know about this. So, of course, the weekend consultant team, the doctors involved with the whole situation, and to the nursing team to say, look, how can we look at this to minimize this kind of stuff happening in the future? And of course, I did direct these individuals, the patient and the family, to PALS, to the liaison team, so that if they still felt like they needed to raise any concerns or complaints about what had happened, they knew what the options were available to them. The purpose of duty of candor is not to just kind of say, all right, so a mistake was made, what do you want me to do about it? Or stuff happens, we're busy, we're doctors. Rather, this is a really important learning point for all of us, because as much as we want to be perfect, things can happen. The situation that I described to you all, it wasn't that the person involved wanted this to happen. It wasn't that the staff looking after this patient wanted it to happen. It's just an unfortunate reality. And this is a good way for us to look back, be introspective, and say, how can I make sure this doesn't happen again? Okay?
Thank you, Ibreez. I'd agree with all of that. And I really like the way you've set it out here. Because at the heart of it, there's something relatively simple of telling the patient, apologize and support, explain what you know to that point, and report it. The reason that reporting is important is really twofold. One is that whilst the duty of candor as a concept is simple, it can be quite complicated, because there's the professional duty we all have as doctors, where patients come to harm, that we're open and honest about them, look after them first, tell them about what the long and short-term consequences might be, as we know, and document it and report it. There's the statutory duty of candor, which we all participate in, but is fundamentally a duty on the organisation. And that has obligations about record keeping and reporting, writing again after a further investigation. So it's really important to use your reporting systems. The other thing I would say is purely from, from looking after doctors, is that sometimes a failure to report can be an issue in itself. So, it's important to sort of do that. And I also want to really emphasize what you said about this isn't about somebody having caused intentional harm. It's not about somebody, it's not really about consent or anything like that. It is simply the fact that a patient has come to harm. So even if they have had a recognised complication, if they reach the harm threshold for the duty of candor, then it would be something that is still reported, as you say, for the purpose of learning from it. It doesn't mean that somebody has done anything wrong. It might be that there has been inappropriate care, but it might not. But they still, needs to be done. I can see a comment here saying, isn't apologising for somebody else's mistake too easy to do? I think I do understand the sentiment in that it feels much more uncomfortable when you're the one who might have been at the centre of it to go and explain that to the patient. What's being set out here is kind of what's expected both in the regulatory framework from the GMC guidance and the statutory guidance. And I guess it's easy to do, but I guess if you're doing it with the right amount of empathy, without simply with the intention of passing blame to other people, etc. If it's clear that's not what you're doing and you're simply explaining what's happened and providing support, that can be quite a useful thing in stopping matters escalating as well.
I think those are all really excellent points. It's not that we need to be concerned about just our apologizing for the sake of apologizing, but a lot does happen in tone and how we present ourselves as well, which can convey a lot to them rather than just, saying, oh, I'm sorry. So on to the next point, knowing your limitations. So with knowing your limitations, sometimes when we come in as new doctors, as international doctors, we really feel like we need to, set the tone. We need to show everyone that we're capable. And when we do this, sometimes we overstep, we overreach. There's also the aspect of what you may have learned in your home country, either part of your internship or any training that you may have formally completed. It may not necessarily equate to the level that you're currently working at in the NHS. So it's okay to ask for help. If you're unsure, if you need something clarified, It's not that anyone's going to think, oh, you're not a capable individual. It's not that anyone's going to think you're not able to function properly by asking this. Rather, you should always preface your work, especially when you're starting out new and you're unsure about something, by saying, actually, can I just double check this with you? Is this how we get it done here? Is this what I should be doing? I've gathered these materials for this procedure. Am I missing anything? As much as possible, if you can practice what you have to do before you actually have to do it, please do that. I understand a lot of you may have logbook experience. You've got a lot of practical skills that you've done and you've got competencies signed off, but still approach everything with fresh eyes, because even moving from trust to trust, sometimes there are just small things that they change in either the consent process or the procedural process that you don't want to slip up on. Remember, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. And I know that seems like you might be thinking to yourself, why would anyone do that? But honestly, it's something I see a lot, where sometimes the international doctor feels that they have to be the very best from day one. They have to show they are the most capable. But really, it makes me think of that song by Billy Joel. I don't know if anyone's heard Vienna. Let Vienna come to you. You don't have to always be chasing after things in order to say that you've accomplished it. Take things in stride. Take things as a journey, that I'm getting to where I have to be. I'm learning, these are my limitations, and I'm learning how to improve to go beyond them. Ed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first part is, the final point you made, take things in stride, is absolutely right, in that it is a challenge, because part of medical training is learning to take more and more responsibility, isn't it, as time goes on. But actually, speaking with colleagues, talking to people about that is really important. And I think that's one of the things, when I was in clinical practice, having a team that used to meet once a week and we talk about difficult cases, when you realize that everybody has cases that are difficult, however senior they are, or complicated, and actually that act of getting other perspectives can be incredibly helpful, throughout your career, not just, in your training. So I think this is all incredibly helpful advice.
All right, on to the next slide. So prescribing safely. Prescriptions seem like our bread and butter. Obviously, we do this from day one. The minute you're an intern, at least I felt, the moment I got to actually prescribe something, I was like, yes, finally, all those hours studying pharmacology made a difference, because now I'm actually managing to apply something that I've learned. And of course, everyone always says, oh, make sure you check their allergies, make sure, they don't have any sort of adverse reaction to anything that they're already taking. But it's not just that. It's about being really smart about when you're prescribing, you're ensuring, either through your documentation or somewhere else in the prescription pack. So it might be that there's a section for indication or anything like that, where you've clearly outlined what is the rationale behind what you're prescribing. Now, obviously, I'm not saying if this individual's already come in with chock full of prescriptions that you need to dissect everything that they've been prescribed. But if you are, for instance, going to prescribe an antibiotic, an antihypertensive, anything like that, how did we get to that point? Because again, that's where your documentation will come up later on. If something has happened, we can come back and say, well, we looked at the benefits and risks and we spoke to these people and this was the conversation that was had. Maybe it was a multidisciplinary conversation. Maybe it was a conversation with the family. The patient didn't want something a certain way, and that's why we went another direction. In terms of also the importance of writing the indications, I had a case when I was just starting out in my internal medicine training on a weekend shift. It's always the weekend with these things. I'm telling you now, it's always the weekend, where I was called and the nursing staff informed me that there was a patient who had been a little unruly overnight. And they felt that this patient needed to be prescribed something that could be given to them overnight to make them more calm. Now, I had generally seen this patient because this was actually my home ward, the ward that I normally work on during the week. And I hadn't seen any indications either myself or through the notes that made sense for this individual to suddenly become unruly overnight. So I wanted to first, of course, ensure there wasn't some sort of underlying pathology that had suddenly cropped up. And of course, I needed to see that, fine, I've understood that through the nursing notes, this is what's happened during the night. What would be an appropriate measure of care? And I had to set out clear indications for when I wanted this type of medication to be given. So I made it very clear that this individual should only be given this medication once we've understood there's nothing else that could be causing the symptoms. We need to see if there's anything else that needed to be taken into consideration for their care, because they weren't someone who was normally, someone not necessarily aggressive, but somebody who would wander or cause issues on the ward. And I made it very clear it should only be prescribed a certain amount of time in those particular situations, and after clarifying first with the on-call doctor if it was appropriate. So you can understand I was very reluctant to prescribe, but I also wanted to make sure in case something had happened or was going to happen, we had everything safety netted for this individual. Unfortunately, they ended up breaking their leg. And when I came back off of my time off after the weekend onto the ward, the consultant sat down with me and said, well, it seems what had happened was they were given this medication and it made them very unstable. They tried to climb out of the bed or something to that extent had happened, and they fell in a way that they broke their leg. And it was coming down to me, and the consultant said, well, why was this prescribed? And I said, look, here was my clear indications for why I wanted it to be prescribed. Were all of these things looked into and ensured before it was actually administered? And they were not. It turns out, unfortunately, that what had happened was there was a situation where they wanted quiet nights on the ward. And there were some individuals who were trying to give medications to just keep people asleep. And I honestly thank my lucky stars that I documented and had very clear indications, because it could have gone in a very terrible direction very quickly if I hadn't laid things out the way I did. So I don't want to again scare you, because I know these are these kind of never ever situations that you don't ever expect to happen, but you don't want to be in that situation at any point in time. So it's very important as much as possible to have clear indications written down. And if you're not sure or confident about prescribing something, or if you feel this prescription should actually be done by the person who is asking you to prescribe it for them, then leave it to them to prescribe. You have the right to advocate for yourself and say, actually, I don't feel confident in this prescription, or I don't feel it's appropriate for me to prescribe, and leave it to them to prescribe. Ed?
Yeah, I think that's sage advice, really. I mean, the GMC recognizes that you can prescribe on the advice of a colleague. You may rely, on another person's assessment in some circumstances. But the really important thing is if someone says, look, why did you do this? There should be a reason beyond, well, they just asked me to. It may be that you work in a haemophilia service where you have haemophilia nurses specifically understand, assessing groups of patients with these indications in accordance with the protocol. And you say, look, we rely on that assessment and in that service. You might say, well, they recommended this. I thought about it. I looked up, I knew this and this about the patient. And in the context of that drug, I thought that was a reasonable recommendation. I went ahead. So I think the point that you're sort of saying there is saying that, look, you are accountable for the prescription. Doesn't mean that the other person isn't accountable at all, but you've also got to share that to some degree. I can also see there's a question about, well, are we talking about handwritten or electronic prescriptions? And I would say that you're probably going to work in a situation where you come across both. Some places have got fully electronic prescriptions. Other places, apart from for very specific drugs, will have electronic prescriptions. Others will be very paper driven. They both carry the same responsibilities. And to be fair, we see errors with electronic prescriptions. They're just sort of slightly different. For example, things picked from a drop-down list incorrectly. Classic is things like depomedrone and depo-provera, mixed up, etc. So, and a lot of the systems, as you say, will have safeguards in, but be vigilant because there's no perfect prescribing system out there.
Exactly. And when in doubt, the BNF or the pharmacist, whoever you can get to that can clarify, especially with certain prescriptions that have really nasty side effects that you really want to ensure before you prescribe it. All right, so raising concerns. So I have a particularly vested interest in this section because I was a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian for a little more than 2 years in my hospital. And my main goal when I was Freedom to Speak Up Guardian was really trying to reach out to IMGs. Not to say that, of course, that other staff weren't important, but I realized when we had to go through our induction and we were learning about the concerns that a lot of people raised, there were very few. I want to say there was probably only 2 in the 10 or 15 years that they had us look at that were actually international doctors. And I don't believe for a second that everything was so perfect and shiny for all of these individuals that they didn't ever feel that they needed to say something. So I just want to say from again, my perspective as a former guardian, come to us if you have anything that you want to talk about. We offer confidentiality. Even if you don't want a solution, if you just want to sit there and say, Ibreez, look, this is what's happening. I don't know what to do. That's fine. You can come and you can vent. And of course, I would still suggest saying, well, here are the things that you can consider doing if you would want to. We're not coming from a place of judgment. We're not coming from a place of pressure that you have to get something done. And even if you don't want to do that, I've had a couple of individuals who have emailed anonymously or left notes in our little box that we have for the Guardians that's saying, you know, these are the things, can you please help and figure out what can be done? So the important thing to remember here, there are options for you to talk about things that are happening that you feel aren't fair, be it the Guardian of Safe Working Hours or the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. So for the safe working hours, if, for instance, you're being rostered in a way that you don't think is fair, so let's say, for instance, your actual roster that you receive is from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., but you're still expected to come to work at 8:30, but you're not paid for that half hour. It's a very common one that I hear. Or just in general, if you think the atmosphere that you're working in, you're not actually in a protected environment as you should be for your level. Having an educational clinical supervisor is also someone that you can talk to. Really, they should be your first point of contact, especially if it's a ward-based issue. But if you think, I don't have time to reach out to them, or I don't know, maybe the issue is surrounding something that they're already aware of and they aren't wanting to take forward, you have the other individuals you've mentioned. And of course, within your indemnity provider and your trade union, please have indemnity coverage, please. I want to shake everyone right now when I say this. We have this, I don't know, belief through a lot of IMGs that they're like, oh, well, the NHS gives us some indemnity, or, you know, I don't really need indemnity. I'm not going to make mistakes, or, you know, what's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen is that you need indemnity and you don't have it. And it's one of those things like insurance that you'd rather just pay for and maybe never have to use, hopefully never have to use, rather than be in a situation where you need it and you don't have it.
Thank you, Ibreez. I think raising concerns is always difficult because, you know, we've not always done well, I think, in healthcare in the UK in terms of dealing with concerns that are raised. And so people feel frustrated. They feel as though it won't necessarily lead to anything. And I would say that that's sometimes true. Sometimes you can get very positive change through it. What I would say is from a kind of perspective of a defence organisation, I'd say, look, your hospital will have a policy about raising concerns. So find that on the internet and follow it, because that's the safest way to raise your concerns and have some chance of them having listened to. The Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, when you go to work tomorrow, you probably see the posters up and think, oh, that's what that is about. I think they're an incredibly helpful resource. And even if it's, look, I don't know what to do, and you're not at the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian stage, as it were, I'm sure you saw a lot of people who are able to direct the right route to have that concern resolved. The other thing I would say about, you know, the whole point of raising concerns is maybe on a slightly less optimistic slant, is that actually, you know, we are seeing doctors being asked to give account of what concerns they raised in relation to care provided 30, 40 years ago, sometimes 50 years ago, in the context of public inquiries, say, for example, the infected blood inquiry, etc., that went on. So, you know, there is some self-interest there as well, that if you see something that is plainly not right, do make sure you follow the proper process in raising your concerns. Be objective, not personal. You know, be factual and straightforward, and that has a lot better chance of being listened to. And in terms of what you said about having an indemnity provider or a defence organisation, I'm not going to sort of give a big sell for MDU. The only thing I would say is that if your reason for not joining a defence organisation is that that you've thought about it, you thought, no, I don't want to spend this money, we have to respect that. If it's because you think I'm a good doctor, so bad things won't happen to me, or I won't find myself in these sorts of situations, I'd say that's probably not a good reason in some ways. So no, that's all I'll say about that. And back to you, Ibreez.
Thank you. All right. The main points, you all, is that, of course, we're here to inform, not to scare. We're here to open the floor for questions, for people to, kind of be a sounding board. Really, it's just about the main points about we're there to help the patient. We know that's why we're there. That's why we're doctors. We are accountable for our actions. We need to make sure everything's very clear in why we're doing it. And we have to understand we can only do so much sometimes, and that's okay. I think that's probably the hardest lesson we learn as doctors is, when you need to ask for help, when you need to understand your competencies. But, that's what we're there for and why we try and learn more at the end of the day. So I want to say that we have some of these free guides on our website. These are booklets you can download on your phone. You can keep them wherever, covering things like prescribing, covering things dealing with bullying or harassment, topics about asking for help, and knowing just basically what you should be doing and how you should be doing it. It's just compilations that we've kind of, if somebody asks, oh, well, what did you wish you knew? A lot of this is that. Taking into account, of course, resources that are available and linking you up so that you understand what you can look into. So please always, with our lovely little QR code, you can connect with us on our various social medias and, find the other links that we have for other resources to help you all succeed and find that success that you're looking for. Because ultimately, it's about supporting each and every one of us to be better doctors, to provide for a better healthcare system, and overall just be there for each other. I think that sometimes we forget that we are there working every day. And sometimes, you're not asking that person next to you how you're doing, but we should, because we're all coming from, different corners of the world to do what? To be the very best that we can be. And sometimes that means taking a pause and understanding you've got this far because, you've understood what needs to be done and how to get it done. All right, Ed, I'll leave this over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ibreez. That was fantastic and incredibly useful. I don't know whether Sarah's overcome the technical issues, but I can see quite a lot of really interesting questions here, and we'll try and we'll try and address some of these. Oh dear, Sarah, I think it's still really problematic on the audio. I can hear you, but it was a whistle again. Do you want to try once more? Well, let's gosh, we've got a lot of really interesting questions here. A lot of them are about mental capacity, and look, we do whole webinars on capacity, and so please do look on our website for questions about that. There's a question about fluctuating capacity here. How can we document and assess? I think recognizing it is helpful, isn't it? Understanding what decision you need to make at that time, etc., is helpful. What can you do? If the capacity fluctuates, is there a better time of day to have those discussions? Those of you working in specialities where this is routine will probably do this quite a lot. There's, those are the simple things. There's some very complicated stuff about how do you do about decisions that interact on each other, such as refusal of insulin, etc. And it comes down to whether those can be treated as separate, distinct decisions you can take every day, or they need to be grouped together. But what I would say is that, look, capacity always generates fascinating questions. Do look on our website to that. Can I put this one to you, Ibreez? Is it acceptable to perform WHO checks prior to induction of anaesthesia, not in English, both patient and myself fluent and native, and I translate crucial points to other colleagues present instead of calling an official interpreter? What do you think about that?
So I actually have an example for this. So I would say it is in the sense that, so I was actually taking care of an oncology patient with one of my consultants, and they needed to be consented for an oncological surgical procedure. And the patient did not speak any English, they only spoke Bengali. Now, I did not speak enough to do. I mean, I've only picked up a little bit, going to medical school in Bangladesh, but Ibrahim did. And he was not actually a doctor on that ward. So I spoke to the consultant and I said, we couldn't unfortunately get an interpreter at the last minute for the situation. Would it be fine for him to come on to, and deal with it? He made sure, of course, the consultant and Ibrahim, that they understood exactly, they were on the same page, what had to be explained and how it had to be explained. And thankfully, essentially what he did was he just basically held up the consent form and went through it step by step, translating each sentence so that the consultant also knew this is the sentence that we're translating right now. Paused, asked the patient if she had any questions. She would then ask. Ibrahim would turn to the consultant, ask him, and it did take a little bit longer. But again, documentation here was the most important thing, and making sure, of course, that the patient was still happy to proceed under these situations. I will also say that I've had situations where I've had to consent patients where I've had to use Google Translate, and it's been the only option after speaking and exhausting every resource that we had available and making it very clear to the consultants who were taking care of the patient as well that this is the only way we can move forward because of whatever the situation was. And again, down to documentation and making sure at every point you're ensuring they understand and that they're happy to proceed and that you've answered all of their questions.
I think that's an incredibly instructive scenario. I think one thing you said there was really important, that, and this question sort of recognized it in terms of translating crucial points to the team. I think you're suggesting, and I would agree, you go further than that so that the other people in the room can be reassured that you're doing a proper translation. The other thing I would say is that there are some fantastic people out there who speak multiple languages. If you're going to do healthcare translation, make sure that you are really capable at speaking in that way before you take on that responsibility. And I'd say as well that, it's not always wrong to use a family member as a translator, but there may be some circumstances where you want a professional translator, because it's quite natural for family members not to share some of the kind of more high, gory details or disturbing news, and sometimes that's not going to work. So yeah, I think that was incredibly helpful. So I'd say we've done quite a bit on capacity, so I'd refer you to our website on that. We've got one here saying, any guidance on responding to a complaint from a patient and reflecting on it in the portfolio? Any observations on that, Ibreez?
I think your first port of call should be, so whenever you've been faced with a complaint, usually some sort of supervisor has mentioned this to you. So in that context, you should speak to your supervisor and understand first, what happened. I've never found that there hasn't been a situation when you speak with your supervisor that they can't actually sit there and help you understand how best to reflect and understand what's happened. Because it could be that complaint is something very minor, just a slip up in how you explained things, or perhaps they felt that you were being curt when you were not being curt. And it could just be language barriers. It could just be that you didn't understand where they were coming from. There wasn't enough of a clarification. But first and foremost, speaking to whoever raised that concern with you to see how it could be done better. If you think that it's actually something that you don't have a lot of experience in, and that's why the complaint came in. So I would say, for instance, for me, my approach to breaking bad news was different once I started working in oncology, because the nuances in an oncological setting, while of course it's the same in how you have to speak to a patient, there are extra things that you have to take into consideration, the types of conversations you have to have with the family as well, and of course the resources that you can then signpost them to that I didn't have to consider some of the other specialities that I had worked in previously. So sitting in with other individuals when they had these conversations with patients really helped me develop my confidence in knowing how to proceed the next time I face that situation, which is a very good learning point that you can then reflect on in your portfolio.
Fantastic, thank you. There's a couple of quick ones that are coming in about translation, saying, is there a professional translator available virtually at any hospital? You very unlikely to have a translator physically on site, but you should have access to telephone translation services. And I've used those, and often they're absolutely fantastic. Actually, they're often extremely experienced and very good. So if it's something that comes up a lot, make sure you've familiarize yourself in terms of how to access that and get the numbers, ask somebody and know at your hospital. I've got a comment here saying, what if I'm a consultant, I can speak the patient's mother tongue fluently? That's absolutely fine if you're having a consultation, no issue with that at all. The point I think we were making were when you're in a team environment and other people also need to know that the patient has been properly informed and is okay to go. Make sure you take that extra care to communicate that to your team as well. So we are with 5 minutes to go, so we'll only be able to do a few more. I think the point about complaints and the portfolio, we've got a lot of guidance on complaints on our website. We also help looking at draft responses. Reflecting on it in the portfolio, remember, you don't put identifiable information there, and reflection is based on what you've learned from that scenario, as you've said, so don't be too put off by that in that setting. Now, let's have a look here. I'd like to acknowledge some helpful comments here, in terms of capacity. So the question of how long a person can retain information is dependent on how long they use that information to weigh up and make their decision. That's absolutely right. It doesn't help that capacity legislation is slightly different in England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. In Scotland, there's an added requirement that the person has to retain memory of having made that decision, which is subtly different. Medico-legally, is it okay to use Google Translate given the language line is super expensive? I would say that I think the thing you've got to recognize is if Google Translate gets it wrong, you will have to be, take the responsibility for that. I think you should check with your management what translation service is expected to be used and do that. That's the safest approach. And I've got one more here that I think might have to be the last one. It's thought that using I apologize is different, saying solely, is there an admission of liability when using apology? What do you think, Ibreez? What's been your experience when you've apologized to patients? What's been sort of the outcome from that?
I've had, obviously, some individuals who, rightfully so, in the heat of everything, are very angry.
Yeah.
And I think that's our important point for us to take that step back and understand where they're coming from. Because, of course, we're able to appreciate everything from our point of view. Medically, we're understanding what's happening. Clinically, we know why we're doing something. But you've got someone who's just coming into this and seeing this is their loved one who they feel is not receiving the right type of care or isn't getting what they actually should have. So I think it's really important that, yes, whether I say I apologize or I'm sorry, I've used them interchangeably, but it's very important to acknowledge their feelings and make sure they're being heard. I think sometimes in our rush to say, look, I didn't do anything wrong, or this is just the way it is, or this is the protocol, we miss out on the human aspect. So I think that's probably the most important thing to make sure we're keeping.
I think that's right. And I think you're right to say that, look, this isn't always an easy path. There is emotion and anger in healthcare, isn't there, often? I think there's a technical question here about, is an apology an admission of liability? On one hand, I can say to you, it absolutely isn't, because there is statutory protection stopping an apology being an admission of liability. But it doesn't mean that you won't have to issue an apology in cases or say sorry where something has gone wrong, where there might be liability attached to it, but the two aren't directly sort of similar. I think there's an important question here saying, if a consultant has raised concerns about you, any advice on how to handle it? Ibreez, we've got a couple of minutes, so I'll come to you on that one.
Yeah, so I actually have had this situation happen a lot to me, and that sounds perhaps maybe bad out of context, but really sometimes it's just about understanding, again, why they feel that there are concerns and what those concerns are. More often than not, you'll find out, unfortunately, they aren't valid concerns. Rather, it's just the system, the workplace culture that unfortunately you're experiencing. And if it's anything that their concerns are related to your performance, you need to understand first what you can show as your kind of response. If, for instance, you have no other concerns in your portfolio, your other workplace assessments are fine, then you have something in your favor saying, well, look, no one else seems to have these issues or concerns. What is the particular thing? If it's something that comes down to someone saying, well, this person's always coming late on the ward, or we can't find them on the ward, or we're not able to contact them when they need to be contacted, there is a paper trail for everything. So it's really ensuring, of course, in that conversation, if you need to have a representative with you, if you need to have someone else who can be there as that middle voice to say, look, we're just trying to be objective about this. No one's pointing any fingers. You need to make sure you're reaching out to the right people. And of course, never go anywhere by yourself. Never answer that email or that message very quickly. Sit down, take a deep breath, and make sure your emotions are collected before you move forward.
I think that's incredibly important advice. I think if you've had concerns raised about you and you're a doctor in training or in a non-consultant post, the one advantage you've got is if you can actually show that you understand what the concerns are and why they would lead to a concern, even if you don't agree with them, that can give a significant amount of the reassurance. And then you can move on to providing an objective and reasonable response to those concerns, or reasoned response to those concerns with evidence. And actually, if someone raises concerns about it and you think, well, actually, yes, I did get that wrong. Actually, you saying, yes, I did get that wrong. This is what I'll do about it is incredibly helpful. So we are now at time. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get to all your questions. Your engagement's been really fantastic. Lots of really sensible and helpful questions raised. I know the slide's been up, but I'd like to point you to our conference for international medical graduates, where we'll look at these sorts of themes and lots of other things as well. There's a QR code about that on the slide that I hope you've had time to consider. So it just falls to me to say thank you to Ibreez for agreeing to present and doing that fantastic session, and thank you all for giving up your evening and for contributing so magnificently to this session. So thank you all very much and good evening.